6 days after Jesus foretells his death and resurrection, he takes a few of his closest friends up to the top of a high mountain. He takes Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. He does not take everyone with him. He wants to be far away from everyone else after the prophecy of his suffering and death and resurrection. I wonder if he wanted to show them his true self. He went away from the rest of the group after a spiritually intense segment of teaching and preaching. The Queer Theology Bible podcast talks about this passage as the coming out of Jesus. Much like when someone is coming out, they need their closest friends around them. They often need to tell the people they trust the most first. Once they are up there on the mountain, something hard to explain happens to Jesus. Jesus changes. His clothes begin to shine with bright light. His face begins to glow like the sun. Not only that, Moses and Elijah, long dead, appear on the mountain, talking with Jesus. He completely shows them who he is in all of his glory. He does not hide any of his power, any of his light, any of his divinity. Jesus displays all of himself, his full God-likeness, his full godness, and his full humanity all at once. When someone may come out to you, this is what they are doing. Whether this was you or someone else, you may recall what it feels like to be fully yourself in front of others you love and who love you. The podcast hosts, Brian and Father Shannon, argue this is why coming out in the queer community is so important. We can't fully be in a relationship with other people until we are fully known. When Jesus reveals himself to the disciples, he also is communing with his Jewish ancestors, with Moses and Elijah. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. Jesus is then the union of both the law and the prophets, the union of the human and the divine. He cannot do what he is about to do in the next part of his life and ministry. Everything he talked about in the previous chapter that would happen to him and to his disciples if they continue to follow him. They must call upon the wisdom of the law and the prophets without seeking the guidance of Moses and Elijah. He would not be ready. In his fullest self, Jesus shines, but he does not forget who he is or where he has come from. When he is most connected to his human and divine self, he meets with Moses and Elijah, and they come to meet with him. But this holy moment, this magical mystery, it cannot last forever. Peter interrupts their conversation. He jumps in saying, "Jesus, it's so good that I'm here. I will build 3 shelters for you. We can stay on this mountain as long as you want." Peter wants to keep this party going, is often what commentators say about him. Or Peter needs to feel needed. I've even heard analysis to the effect that Peter wanted attention, and he was seeking attention from Jesus and wanted to elevate himself. But as I read this passage again this week, I wondered something different. I wondered if Peter was trying to protect his beloved Jesus. After all, Jesus has prophesied some terrifying realities only a week before. Realities like the death that will come if people continue to follow him, his own impending torture and crucifixion and death. Imagine seeing your rabbi, your friend, your leader, being the fullest version of themselves. Away with you and a few close friends, communing with your spiritual ancestors and tapping into the wisdom that brings you life and energy. Why wouldn't Peter want that to keep on going? Wouldn't we all want to linger just a little bit longer up on that mountaintop? Maybe if they stay up there, everything Jesus said, all the bad things Jesus said would happen, just won't happen. Maybe they won't come true at all. Perhaps they can enjoy this powerful and sacred time with their spiritual ancestors without any concern for those prophecies that Jesus gave. But even before Peter could finish that proposal, a bright cloud overshadows everything and everyone. And from this cloud, a loud voice says, much like it did at the baptism of Jesus, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." This moment recalls the baptism of Jesus by John. A dove descends and a voice speaks from the heavens, saying words that almost exactly parallel these words. Both his baptism and his transfiguration are transitional moments in the life and ministry of Jesus, the perfect bookends for the beginning and end of his 3 years of ministry on earth. And even in this beautiful poetic parallel, Peter, James, and John were all afraid. They fell on their faces, terrified of everything happening around them. The transformation of Jesus, the appearance of Moses and Elijah, the bright cloud and the bodiless voice calling out to them. But Jesus comes over to them. In the midst of that bright light, the majesty of it all, Jesus does not forget his friends. He touches them. Matthew tells us that Jesus touches them and says to them first, "Get up." He does not tell them to stop being afraid. He tells them to get up in the midst of their fear, in spite of their very selves. Now, Jesus, that is easy to say, isn't it? And harder to do. When they finally looked up, it was like nothing had happened. Jesus was before them alone. The bright cloud was gone. The voice was gone. Moses and Elijah, like they had never been there at all. The clothes and face of Jesus were no longer glowing with light. Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone anything. Keep this a secret until the resurrection, my resurrection, to be specific, the one he prophesied only a week before." For Jesus, this transfiguration was not something to broadcast in front of the rest of his followers. Unlike his baptism, this holy declaration of his belovedness and belonging to God happens in front of a handful of people. Jesus is vulnerable and full of power at the same time. This is a very intimate moment with a few of the disciples. This is the passage that sets the stage for the beginning of Lent for all of us. Because after this, Jesus now turns his face toward the city of Jerusalem and his impending death. He needed that visit on the mountaintop to give him the courage to continue. The transfiguration gave Jesus the strength to leave that mountain and head towards the holy city. But before we all go down that mountain with Jesus, I'd like to linger there for a moment. In fact, I'd like us to go back up to verse 4 when Peter jumps in and says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings just for us, one for you, for Moses and Elijah." I don't think Peter deserves the bad reputation he often receives in this passage. Perhaps he isn't being pushy or insecure or arrogant when he walks up to Jesus and makes this offer. Perhaps he is sincere in his offer to create space and time for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah to dwell on the mountain a little bit longer. What's the rush, he seems to say. I'd be so happy to make that possible that I will stay and build them myself. Part of being in true relationship with each other is having the courage to be the fullest versions of ourselves, like Jesus did when he prophesied about the realities of his death, his resurrection. He took this a step further and transformed into a being full of light and brilliance in front of Peter and James and John. And although I referred to this full sequence as the coming out of Jesus earlier, I am curious about what happens next. What happens when Jesus has his coming back? What happens when Jesus heads down to the rest of the disciples and the people waiting for him below? When someone in our lives shows us who they really are, how do we respond? Do we acknowledge the risk that they take in being their full selves? Do we name how vulnerable and powerful they are? I want us to consider what it would be like to respond as Peter does to Jesus. In our own way, we want to protect the people we love. We want to keep them safe from harm, especially if we hear about future danger before it happens, much like Peter, James, and John did. Peter did not want harm to befall his beloved Jesus. He does not want this time on the mountain to end. He sees Jesus in all of his glory and grandeur and wants to keep his beautiful life safe. I see myself in Peter, and I wonder if you might as well. I often want to keep the people I love out of difficult or risky situations. I sometimes want to cocoon them from the world's troubles. And although I cannot do those things, much like Peter cannot build shelters for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, none of us can protect each other completely from harm or pain or trouble. But we can make transfiguration moments, holy moments of transcendence, possible with one another. These are the kinds of segments of time where we are not distracted or concerned with the difficulties of the day, of the month ahead, of the bad news we heard the moment before. We are free from distractions in these transfiguration moments. What we want is pure connection with each other. We want deep relationships where we can receive the vulnerability and the power of those we love. We can offer them a brave space to fully reveal who they are. Peter's desire to create shelters is human. It is a desire we know because we are human too. We want to build a place where all can be the fullest expression of who God created us all to be, in our glory, in our light, in our transcendence. We want a place that reminds me of something the poet Siegfried Sassoon says in his poem, Everyone Sang. He says, "Everyone suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight as prisoned birds must find in freedom, winging wildly across the white orchards and dark green fields, on, and out of sight. Everyone's voice was suddenly lifted, and beauty came like the setting sun. My heart was shaken with tears, and horror drifted away. Oh, but everyone was a bird, and the song was wordless. The singing will never be done.